The thunder rumbled like a warning shot across the Montana sky, as Hope Blackwood clutched her infant daughter tighter against her chest, the rain soaking through her threadbare shawl and turning the letter in her trembling hand into a sodden mess of running ink and broken promises. Sweetgrass, Montana Territory, 1878, was no place for a woman alone with a child, especially not in a deluge that threatened to wash away what little courage she had mustered for this desperate journey. The stagecoach had departed hours ago, leaving her stranded outside the small frontier town, her last coins spent on the journey that had brought her here based on nothing but a hastily scrawled address and hollow assurances. The baby whimpered, her tiny face scrunched against the onslaught of rain, and Hope felt tears mingling with the raindrops on her cheeks. There was no shelter in sight, just the distant outline of buildings through the gray curtain of water, still too far to reach with her heavy carpetbag and precious bundle. "Looks like you could use some help, madam," came a deep voice, startling her from her despair. Hope turned blinking rain from her eyes to find a tall figure on horseback had approached without her noticing. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, and as he stepped closer, she could see he wore a worn leather duster and a wide-brimmed hat that kept the rain from his face. His spurs jingled softly as he closed the distance between them. He stopped a respectful distance away, eyeing the baby and the drenched letter in her hand. Then the cowboy stepped forward and whispered, "I don't mean to frighten you, but this ain't weather fit for man nor beast, let alone a little one." His voice was gentle, with a hint of Texas in its cadence. "I'm Yates Blackburn," he continued, removing his hat to reveal tousled dark hair. "Town marshal of Sweetgrass, such as it is. Would you allow me to escort you somewhere dry?" Hope hesitated, years of caution warring with her desperate situation. The baby gave another cry, this one louder and more insistent. "My name is Hope Blackwood," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the rain. "And this is my daughter, Melody." She looked down at the sodden paper in her hand. "I was told her father would be here, but—" Yates's expression softened. "Madam, I know every soul in Sweetgrass." "Who were you looking for?" "Caleb Morrison," she whispered, the name bitter on her tongue. A shadow crossed the marshal's face. "I think we'd best get you two out of this rain first, then we can talk about Morrison." Without waiting for her response, he gathered her carpetbag, then led his horse closer. "Can you ride, Miss Blackwood?" "Mrs.," she corrected automatically, though the title felt like a lie. "And yes, I can." With surprising gentleness for his large frame, Yates helped her mount, handing Melody up to her once she was settled. Then he took the reins and began leading them toward town, his steady presence somehow more comforting than it should have been to a woman who'd learned the hard way not to trust a man's promises. Little did Hope know that this rain-soaked meeting would be the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever, there in the untamed heart of Montana Territory. The town of Sweetgrass appeared through the rain like a mirage, a single muddy street lined with wooden buildings, some boasting false fronts that reached optimistically toward the sky. Lanterns glowed in windows, their light diffused by the heavy rainfall. Hope held Melody close, trying to shield the infant from the worst of the downpour, as Yates led them toward a modest two-story building with marshal's office painted on a weathered sign. "My quarters are upstairs," Yates explained as they reached the hitching post. "It ain't much, but it's dry." He helped her dismount with steady hands, then quickly secured his horse before ushering them inside. The marshal's office was spare but tidy: a desk, a wooden chair, a pot-bellied stove radiating blessed heat, and a cell with iron bars at the back. "This way," he said, leading her to a narrow staircase. The rooms above were equally modest: a small sitting area with a stove of its own, a bedroom visible through a partially open door, and a kitchen space with a table and 2 chairs. "Mrs. Jackson from the boarding house brings meals sometimes," he explained, almost apologetically. "Let me get you some towels." When he returned, Hope had managed to unwrap Melody from her sodden blankets. The baby's face was red from crying, her tiny fists waving in protest at the uncomfortable journey. "She's hungry," Hope explained, accepting the towel gratefully. And I'm afraid her spare clothes may be wet through as well. Yates nodded, looking surprisingly unperturbed by the presence of a distressed infant. I'll step out while you tend to her. There's a screen there you can put up for privacy. I'll see about finding some dry things for the little one. True to his word, he returned some time later with a knock at his own door, waiting for Hope's soft "come in" before entering. In his arms was a small bundle of fabric. Mrs. Jackson had these left from her grandchildren's visits, he explained. Said you're welcome to them. Hope had managed to feed Melody, who now dozed against her shoulder, pink-cheeked and content. That's very kind, she said, still uncertain what to make of this unexpected assistance. Yates set the baby clothes down, then moved to stoke the fire. Now about Morrison, he said carefully. Hope tensed. You know him, knew him, Yates corrected, turning to face her. Caleb Morrison left Sweetgrass nearly 6 months ago. There was trouble, gambling debts, accusations of cheating. He rode out one night ahead of some very angry men. The news hit Hope like a physical blow. 6 months ago, she'd still been receiving his letters, filled with promises about the life they would build once she joined him in Montana. Letters that had convinced her to leave behind everything familiar in St. Louis after her father's death left her with nothing but debts. I see, she managed, her voice hollow. Yates studied her face. He was expecting you, Hope laughed bitterly. So he claimed, I have a dozen letters saying as much. She looked down at Melody. He doesn't know about her, I wrote, but the letters never caught up to him, Yates finished. He ran a hand through his damp hair. I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwood. The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Hope blinked rapidly, determined not to cry. It appears I've made a terrible mistake in coming here. What will you do now? He asked quietly. It was the question she'd been avoiding since the moment he'd told her Caleb was gone. Her funds were exhausted. She had no family to return to, no prospects in St. Louis or anywhere else. I don't know, she admitted. I had hoped. She trailed off, the foolishness of her hope painfully apparent. Yates moved to the window, looking out at the rain-washed street below. Sweetgrass ain't much, but it's growing. The railroad's coming through next year. There's opportunity here for those willing to work. Hope shifted Melody to her other shoulder. Are you suggesting I stay? I'm suggesting you don't make any decisions tonight, he replied. Rest. In the morning, I'll introduce you to some folks who might be able to help. She wanted to refuse, to maintain what little pride she had left, but the reality of her situation was inescapable. Why would you help us? You don't know me. Yates turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. My ma traveled west with 3 young ones after my pa was killed in the war. A stranger's kindness saved us. I'm just passing it along. There was something in his voice, a quiet intensity that told Hope he wasn't a man given to casual lies or empty gestures. It had been so long since she'd encountered genuine decency that she hardly knew how to respond to it. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded. You take the bed, I'll be fine out here. Hope wanted to protest, but exhaustion was overtaking her. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, at least, she and Melody were safe and dry, which was more than she dared hope for when standing in the rain just hours before. As she settled Melody into a makeshift crib formed from a drawer lined with clean linens, Hope heard Yates moving quietly in the other room. She wondered what twist of fate had placed this particular man in her path tonight, and whether she dared believe that perhaps, finally, her luck had changed. Morning brought weak sunshine, and the cacophony of a frontier town coming to life, horses nickering, wagons rattling over rutted streets, men calling greetings. Hope woke disoriented, the events of the previous day rushing back as Melody began to fuss beside her. After tending to the baby, Hope straightened her crumpled dress as best she could and ventured into the main room. Yates was nowhere to be seen, but a note lay on the table alongside a pot of coffee still warm on the stove. Gone to make rounds, it read in a surprisingly neat hand. Help yourself to breakfast, back soon. True to his word, he returned as Hope was finishing a simple meal of bread and preserves, Melody contentedly exploring a wooden spoon in her lap. Morning, Yates greeted, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Sleep well. Better than I expected, Hope admitted. Thank you, he nodded, pouring himself coffee. I spoke with Mrs. Jackson at the boarding house. She has a room available if you're interested. Hope set down her cup. That's very kind, but I have no way to pay for lodging at present. She needs help with the cooking and cleaning, Yates said. Said she'd be willing to exchange work for the room, at least until you find your feet. Hope felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I'd be grateful for the introduction. The boarding house proved to be a well-maintained two-story building at the quieter end of town. Mrs. Jackson was a brisk, practical woman in her 60s who assessed Hope with sharp eyes, but softened visibly at the sight of Melody. Never could resist a baby, she admitted, offering a finger for Melody to grasp. Raised 6 of my own plus 2 grandchildren after my daughter passed, she showed Hope to a small but clean room at the back of the house. It ain't fancy, but it's private. 3 meals a day plus whatever the baby needs. In exchange, I need help with the cooking, cleaning, and laundry. I'm a good cook, Hope offered, and I learn quickly. Mrs. Jackson nodded approvingly. Marshall says you're in a difficult situation. I don't need details. We all came west for our reasons. She gave Hope a knowing look. Some of us were running from something, some running to something. And which were you, Mrs. Jackson? Hope asked before she could stop herself. The older woman's lips quirked in a half-smile. Bit of both, I expect, same as most. She turned practical again. There's a community here, Mrs. Blackwood, folks who help each other. You do your part, you'll find your place. As they returned downstairs, Yates was waiting in the parlor, looking slightly out of place among the feminine touches Mrs. Jackson had incorporated into the public spaces. All settled, he asked. Hope nodded. Thanks to your intervention. Mrs. Jackson snorted. Yates Blackburn, don't pretend you haven't been looking for an excuse to get someone else's cooking regular like. That poor woman at the cafe can only do so much with a man who's got the appetite of a bear coming out of hibernation. A faint flush colored Yates's cheeks, and Hope found herself smiling at his discomfort. There was something reassuring about seeing this imposing man embarrassed by an elderly woman's teasing. I should return to my duties, he said, reaching for his hat. Mrs. Blackwood, if you need anything, my office is just down the street. After he left, Mrs. Jackson gave Hope a speculative look. That man's been the marshal here going on 5 years. Never seen him take such an interest in a newcomer before. He was merely being kind, Hope said quickly. Was all Mrs. Jackson said, but her expression spoke volumes. Well, get yourself settled in. You can start helping with supper tonight. Over the next few weeks, Hope fell into the rhythm of life at the boarding house. The work was hard but straightforward, and Mrs. Jackson proved to be a fair-minded employer who doted on Melody when Hope's hands were full. The boarders, mostly men working on the coming railroad or passing through on business, were respectful, especially after learning that Yates had taken a personal interest in Hope's welfare. The marshal himself was a regular presence, stopping by most evenings after his rounds to inquire after their well-being. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a carved wooden toy for Melody, fresh berries from a farm outside town, a ribbon for Hope's hair that matched her blue eyes so perfectly she wondered if he'd noticed their color. He's courting you, Mrs. Jackson declared one afternoon as they prepared dinner after Yates had dropped off a book he thought Hope might enjoy. Don't be ridiculous, Hope protested, though her cheeks warmed. He's simply being neighborly. Mrs. Jackson raised an eyebrow. That man rode 15 miles to the Henderson place just to get those strawberries last week. Didn't bring me any, and I've known him since he came to town. Hope concentrated on kneading bread dough. Perhaps he feels sorry for us. Perhaps, Mrs. Jackson conceded, but that don't explain why he's taken to shaving twice a day and wearing his good shirt every time he comes calling. Hope had noticed the changes in his appearance, but had attributed them to her own growing awareness of him as a man rather than just the marshal. Now she wondered if there might be more to it. That evening, when Yates stopped by after supper, Hope found herself watching him more carefully. He sat in the parlor, bouncing Melody on his knee with the easy confidence of a man who'd been around children before. The baby had taken to him immediately, a fact that both pleased and alarmed Hope. Attachment brought vulnerability, as she well knew. Mrs. Jackson tells me you're becoming indispensable around here. Yates commented as Melody grabbed for his watch chain. Hope smiled. She exaggerates. But I'm grateful for the work. I had a letter today, he said, his tone deliberately casual. From the sheriff over in Helena. Seems Caleb Morrison turned up there. Hope's hand stilled in her lap. Oh, got himself in trouble again. Nothing too serious this time, just drunk and disorderly. Sheriff recognized the name from my inquiries. Hope appreciated that Yates had been making discreet attempts to locate Caleb, though she'd told him it wasn't necessary. Part of her had hoped never to hear the man's name again. I see, she said carefully. Did you tell him about Melody? Yates shook his head. Didn't seem my place to do so, but I thought you should know where he is in case you wanted to contact him yourself. The fact that he'd brought the information to her, despite what must be his own reservations, spoke volumes about his character. Hope found herself studying his face, the strong line of his jaw, the kindness in his eyes that balanced the hardness his job sometimes required. Thank you for telling me, she said finally, but I have no interest in contacting him. Caleb made his choices, I'm making mine. Something flashed in Yates's eyes, relief perhaps, or something warmer. Fair enough, he said simply, but his smile held a new ease. Later, after he'd gone and Hope was preparing for bed, she found herself thinking about the conversation. For months, she had defined herself by Caleb's betrayal as a woman abandoned, a mother left to fend for herself. But here in Sweetgrass, she was becoming something else, a woman standing on her own, making her own way. And perhaps, she admitted to herself as she drifted towards sleep, a woman who was beginning to care for a certain marshal more than was entirely wise. Summer bloomed across the Montana prairie, painting the landscape in wildflowers and verdant grass. Hope's position at the boarding house had evolved from an act of charity to a genuine partnership with Mrs. Jackson, who admitted that Hope's cooking had improved business considerably. Men will put up with a lot for a decent meal and clean sheets, the older woman observed. You've got a gift, girl. The compliment warmed Hope, who had never thought of herself as particularly talented at anything. Incent. Louis, she'd been merely the daughter of a struggling merchant, then briefly the wife of a charming drifter who'd swept her off her feet with promises he never intended to keep. Here, she was becoming known for her own merits, her apple pies that sold out at the church social, her calm efficiency in managing the boarding house when Mrs. Jackson's rheumatism flared, her gentle way with not only Melody but the other children in town who'd come to adore Miss Hope's stories. Melody, now nearly 8 months old, was thriving. She had begun to crawl, exploring every corner of the boarding house with determined curiosity. Her first word had been mama, but her second, to Hope's mingled amusement and concern, sounded suspiciously like yay, her attempt at Yates. The marshal remained a steady presence in their lives. His visits had evolved from brief check-ins to longer stays, often sharing supper with Hope after the other boarders had finished. Sometimes they sat on the back porch afterward, talking as twilight deepened and Melody slept in Hope's arms. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about losing his father in the war and how his mother had packed up her children and headed west to start anew. About the years he'd spent working cattle before a local sheriff had taken him under his wing and steered him toward law enforcement. In turn, Hope shared stories of her own life, her happy childhood ended by her mother's early death, her father's struggle to keep his business afloat, the whirlwind courtship with Caleb that had seemed like salvation at the time. I was so naive, she admitted one evening, the confession easier in the gathering darkness. He was handsome and charming with all these grand plans. When my father died and the creditors took everything, Caleb's promise to establish us out west seemed like the answer to my prayers. Yates was quiet for a moment. You were young and in a desperate situation, and Morrison could be convincing when it suited him. You knew him well, Hope asked. Well enough to know he wasn't the settling type, Yates said carefully. He worked odd jobs, gambled what he earned. Had a way with words, especially where women were concerned. You're being kind, Hope said ruefully. In plain language, he was a scoundrel and I was a fool. Not a fool, Yates corrected firmly. Just someone who wanted to believe in something good. There's no shame in that. His defense of her touched Hope deeply. She had spent so long blaming herself for her poor judgment that his perspective came as a balm to her wounded pride. Besides, he added with a smile that transformed his serious face, if you hadn't trusted him, you wouldn't have come to Sweetgrass. And then where would Mrs. Jackson be? Or the church social committee, or me, for that matter? And where are you, Marshal Blackburn? Hope asked softly, emboldened by the intimacy of the moment. He turned to face her fully, his expression earnest in the fading light. I'm sitting next to a woman I admire more each day, hoping I'm not overstepping by saying so. Hope's heart quickened. You're not overstepping. Before either could say more, Melody stirred and began to fuss, the moment broken. But as Yates helped Hope to her feet, his hand lingered on hers a beat longer than necessary, and the look that passed between them held promises neither was quite ready to voice. The following Sunday after church services, Yates approached Hope with an unusual request. The Hendersons are having a barn raising and social next Saturday, he said, uncharacteristically hesitant. I wondered if you and Melody might like to go. It's about an hour's ride, but Jim Peters has offered his wagon. Hope was surprised. They had never ventured beyond Sweetgrass together, and a social gathering would be a public statement of something. What exactly, she wasn't quite sure. As friends, she asked, needing clarification. Yates's expression was serious. If that's what you prefer. Or as something more, if you're amenable. Mrs. Jackson, who had been shamelessly eavesdropping nearby, suddenly developed an intense interest in straightening the church bulletins. Hope felt a flutter of both excitement and trepidation. I would be delighted to accompany you, she said formally, then added with a smile. And I suspect Melody would never forgive me if I declined on her behalf. The day of the social dawned clear and warm. Hope dressed with particular care in her best dress, a blue calico she'd remade from one of Mrs. Jackson's cast-offs, with a new collar she'd splurged on from the general store. She dressed Melody in a white gown with tiny embroidered flowers, a gift from the ladies' auxiliary who had taken the motherless child into their collective hearts. Yates arrived promptly at 9, looking distinctly unmarshal like in clean denims and a new shirt, his dark hair tamed and his usually stubbled jaw smooth. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. For the little one, he explained, handing it to Hope. Inside was a sunbonnet sized perfectly for Melody, made of sturdy cotton with a blue ribbon that matched Hope's dress. Yates, it's lovely, Hope said, genuinely touched. But how did you know what size? Mrs. Jackson might have helped, he admitted with a sheepish smile. And Miss Henderson at the millinery shop, and possibly Mrs. Peterson from the general store, Hope laughed, imagining the townswomen giving the serious marshal advice on baby bonnet purchases. I see the entire community has been enlisted in your efforts. It takes a village to court a lady properly, he replied, then looked momentarily abashed at his own boldness. The ride to the Henderson farm was pleasant, with Melody contentedly exploring the wrapped sandwiches Mrs. Jackson had prepared for their lunch. Yates pointed out landmarks along the way, the creek where the best fishing was to be had, the ridge where a legendary gunfight had occurred years before, the distant mountains that formed the backbone of the territory. The Henderson place was already bustling with activity when they arrived. Men were raising the frame of the new barn, while women had set up tables laden with food under the shade of cottonwood trees. Children ran about in excited packs, and somewhere a fiddle was being tuned. Hope was introduced to what seemed like dozens of people, all curious about the woman who had caught their marshal's attention. She found herself welcomed with genuine warmth, particularly by Rachel Henderson, the farmer's wife, who immediately pressed a glass of lemonade into her hand. About time Yates found himself someone, the older woman said frankly. Been watching him pine after you for months. Oh, we're not, Hope began, but Rachel waved her protest away. Not yet, maybe, but he's never brought anyone to one of our gatherings before. That man's intentions are as clear as the writing on a wanted poster. The barn raising proceeded with the organized chaos of a community effort. Even with her limited experience of such things, Hope could see that Yates was respected among these people. Men sought his opinion, deferred to his judgment on matters of construction. He worked alongside them, his strength evident as he helped lift heavy beams into place, but there was no posturing, no need to prove himself. As afternoon stretched toward evening and the work was completed, tables were arranged in the newly framed structure. Lanterns were hung from the rafters, casting a golden glow over the gathering. After a blessing from the preacher, everyone filled plates with the bounty the women had prepared. "Your marshal hasn't taken his eyes off you all day," Rachel observed as she and Hope served slices of pie. Even when he was 30 feet up setting roof joists, Hope blushed. "He's very attentive." "He's smitten," Rachel corrected with a knowing smile. "And unless I miss my guess, the feeling's mutual." Before Hope could respond, the first strains of music filled the barn as several men with instruments took their places at one end. Couples began to move to the cleared area in the center, and children skipped around the edges. Yates appeared at Hope's side, looking slightly nervous. "Would you care to dance, Mrs. Blackwood?" Hope hesitated, glancing to where Melody was contentedly sitting in Rachel Henderson's lap. "I haven't danced in years." "Neither have I," he admitted, "but I'd be honored if you'd join me anyway." The music was a simple waltz, slow enough for uncertain feet. Yates's hand was warm at her waist, his other engulfing hers with gentle pressure. They moved somewhat stiffly at first, each conscious of maintaining proper distance despite the intimacy of the moment. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Yates said as they circled the floor. Hope looked up at him, noting the unusual tension in his jaw. "Yes, the stage line's hiring. They need a station manager here in Sweetgrass." He guided her around another couple. "It's a good position. Comes with housing, 2 bedrooms." Hope tried to follow his meaning. "Are you suggesting I apply for the job?" Yates shook his head. "No, the job's been offered to me." "Oh." Hope felt a sudden hollowness. "You're leaving Sweetgrass." "Not exactly." The music changed to something slower, and they naturally drew closer. "The station master's house is on the edge of town, within the town limits, so I could continue as marshal, but it would mean giving up my rooms above the office." Hope was still confused. "I'm not sure I understand why you're telling me this." Yates took a deep breath. "Because I was hoping you might consider sharing it, the house, I mean, with me." The dance forgotten, Hope stopped moving. "Yates Blackburn, are you proposing to me in the middle of a barn dance?" His face reddened, but he met her gaze steadily. "Not very romantic, is it? I had a speech planned, and better timing." A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside Hope, surprising both of them. "Actually, I think it's perfectly romantic." Yates's expression shifted from embarrassment to cautious hope. "You do?" "I do," she confirmed softly. "And in answer to your not quite question, I would be honored to consider it, but perhaps we might discuss the details somewhere more private." Relief washed over his features. "Of course, yes. Whenever you'd like." They resumed dancing, but something had fundamentally changed between them. Hope felt it in the way he held her just a fraction closer, in the way her own body responded to his nearness. They had acknowledged what had been growing between them for months, and having done so, there was no going back. Later, as the celebration continued around them, they stepped outside into the cool evening air. Stars blazed overhead in the vast Montana sky, and the sounds of music and laughter spilled from the barn behind them. "I should have done this properly," Yates said, turning to face her. "You deserve better than a clumsy proposal on a dance floor." Hope shook her head. "I don't need proper, Yates. I just need honest." He took her hands in his. "Then, honestly, Hope Blackwood, I have been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you standing in the rain with your daughter in your arms. You are the strongest, most determined woman I've ever known, and nothing would make me prouder than to call you my wife." Tears pricked at Hope's eyes. "Even knowing my history, the mistakes I've made, we've all got history," he said simply. "It's what brought us here to this moment. And I wouldn't change a bit of it because it led me to you." In the silver moonlight, with the sounds of celebration providing a fitting backdrop, Hope made the easiest decision of her life. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Yates Blackburn." His kiss was gentle at first, a question still, even after her acceptance. But when Hope responded with all the feeling she'd been holding back for months, his restraint melted away. His arms encircled her, strong and sure, and Hope felt for the first time in years that she had found her true home. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, Hope rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. What will people say? A respectable marshal marrying a woman with such a scandalous past, Yates chuckled, the sound rumbling under her ear. They'll say I'm the luckiest man in Montana territory, and they'll be right. The news of their engagement spread through Sweetgrass like wildfire. By the time they returned from the Henderson farm the following day, it seemed everyone in town had heard. Mrs. Jackson met them at the boarding house with barely contained excitement. "About time," she declared, hugging Hope fiercely. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the pantry together." In the weeks that followed, preparations for both the wedding and their new home consumed much of Hope's time. The station master's house needed fresh paint, minor repairs, a garden plot cleared for spring planting. Hope found herself there most afternoons, Melody crawling happily on a blanket as Hope scrubbed floors and hung curtains. Yates joined her when his duties allowed, his sleeves rolled up as he fixed loose boards and repaired the sagging front porch. Sometimes they worked in companionable silence. Other times, they talked about their future hopes for more children, plans for the house, dreams for what Sweetgrass might become when the railroad finally arrived. One evening, as they sat on the newly repaired porch steps watching the sunset, Yates broached a subject they had carefully avoided. "I've been thinking about Melody's future," he said, watching the baby as she practiced pulling herself up on a chair. "When we're married, I'd like to adopt her legally, make her my daughter in the eyes of the law as well as in my heart." Hope felt a swell of emotion so intense it momentarily robbed her of speech. Of all the ways Yates had shown his love, this touched her most deeply. "You would do that?" she asked when she could trust her voice. "I would be honored," he said simply. "If you're agreeable." Hope reached for his hand. More than agreeable, grateful beyond words, his fingers tightened around hers. "There's something else. I've been corresponding with a lawyer in Helena about changing her name. If we do this, she would be Melody Blackburn." "Not Blackwood Blackburn?" Hope asked, surprised by the suggestion. Yates looked uncertain for the first time. "I thought it might be simpler for her growing up." "But if you prefer to keep Blackwood as part of her name." "No," Hope interrupted gently. "You're right. Melody Blackburn sounds perfect." She smiled at the baby, who was watching them with bright, curious eyes. "What do you think, little one? Do you want to be a Blackburn like your new papa?" Melody babbled happily, reaching for Yates, who scooped her up with practiced ease. "I think that's a yes," he said, his voice suspiciously gruff. The wedding took place on a perfect autumn day, with the aspen trees turning gold against the blue Montana sky. The entire town turned out for the ceremony in the small white church, followed by a celebration that spilled onto the main street. Hope wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Jackson and the other women had secretly arranged to have sent from Denver. Melody, now toddling with determination, scattered flower petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy, delighting the congregation. Yates waited at the altar looking both nervous and happier than Hope had ever seen him, his dark hair tamed and his marshal's badge polished to a high shine on his best jacket. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was brief but filled with promise, eliciting cheers and a few good-natured whistles from the crowd. The reception at the newly completed station master's house, their house now lasted well into the evening. Hope found herself surrounded by people who, in the space of a few months, had become like family to her. Mrs. Jackson dabbed at her eyes repeatedly, declaring she'd never been so happy to lose her best boarder. "You've made quite an impression on this town," Yates observed as they finally had a moment alone, watching their guests from the porch of their new home. Hope leaned against him, his arm a comforting weight around her shoulders. "As have you, Marshal Blackburn. Half the young girls in town are heartbroken today," he laughed, pulling her closer. "I only ever had eyes for one woman in Sweetgrass." "Lucky for me," Hope murmured, tilting her face up for his kiss. Later, with Melody asleep in her new bedroom and their guests departed, Hope and Yates stood in the doorway of their home, looking out at the star-filled sky. "I never thought I'd find this," Hope admitted softly. After everything with Caleb, I believed this kind of happiness wasn't meant for me. Yates turned her to face him, his expression serious in the lamplight. When I saw you that day in the rain, something told me my life was about to change. I didn't know how exactly, but I knew you were important. A bedraggled woman with a baby and a sodden letter, Hope teased gently. The bravest woman I'd ever seen, he corrected. Standing tall despite everything. How could I not fall in love with that kind of courage? Hope reached up to touch his face, wondering at the journey that had brought them to this moment. I love you, Yates Blackburn. More than I ever thought possible. And I love you, Hope Blackburn, he replied, the new name filling her with quiet joy. Now and always. As he closed the door on the outside world and took her hand to lead her toward their new life together, Hope reflected that sometimes the greatest acts of courage were not grand gestures or heroic deeds, but simply opening one's heart to love again, when all evidence suggested it was the most foolish thing one could do. And sometimes, she knew with certainty, it was the wisest choice of all. 2 years later, Hope stood on the front porch of their home, watching as the daily stagecoach departed from the station Yates now managed alongside his marshal duties. Melody, nearly 3 years old and full of boundless energy, chased butterflies in the front garden, her dark curls bouncing with each step. In Hope's arms, 6-month-old Jackson Blackburn dozed contentedly, his tiny hand curled around her finger. Named for Mrs. Jackson, who had become like a mother to Hope, the boy had his father's serious eyes and his mother's determined chin. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her smile. Right on time, as always. Yates appeared around the bend in the road, his horse at an easy trot. He dismounted at the gate, grinning as Melody abandoned her butterfly chase to race toward him. "Papa, Papa," she squealed as he swung her high into the air. "There's my girl," he said, settling her on his hip as he made his way to the porch, "and there's my beautiful wife and son." Hope met him with a kiss. "How were your rounds?" "Quiet," he reported, "which is just how I like them these days." Sweetgrass had grown considerably since the railroad's arrival the previous year. New businesses had opened, more families had settled, and with them had come increased responsibilities for the town marshal. But Yates had also hired a deputy, allowing him more time with his family and his work at the stage station. Mrs. Henderson sent over some fresh eggs, Hope told him as they entered the house together. "And a jar of that blackberry preserves you like so much." "That woman's determined to fatten me up," Yates complained without heat, settling Melody at the kitchen table where her slate and chalk waited for her daily writing practice. "She says you're still too thin," Hope replied, transferring Jackson to his father's waiting arms so she could check on the stew simmering on the stove. "Something about growing boys needing meat on their bones." Yates snorted, but his expression was tender as he looked down at his son. "What do you think, Jack? Is your old man wasting away?" The baby gurgled happily, reaching for the badge that still gleamed on Yates's chest. These quiet family moments were what Hope cherished most about their life together. The rhythm they had established Yates's morning rounds, Hope's work in the garden and kitchen, their evenings spent together on the porch, or by the fire held a contentment she had never imagined possible during those dark days in St. Louis or that rainy afternoon when she'd first arrived in Sweetgrass. Later, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Hope and Yates sat together on the porch swing he had built for her birthday. The evening was warm, scented with the roses she had planted along the front walkway. "Letter came for you today," Yates said, reaching into his pocket. "From Helena." Hope took the envelope, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Eleanor Hayes had been a fellow boarder at Mrs. Jackson's briefly before taking a position as a schoolteacher in the capital. They had maintained a correspondence since. "Eleanor's getting married," Hope announced after scanning the letter. "To a lawyer she met through her school board work. She wants us to come for the wedding next month." "We could make a family trip of it," Yates suggested. "Show the children the capital. Maybe take the train instead of the stage." Hope nodded, tucking the letter away. "Melody would love that. She's still talking about the train whistle she heard yesterday." They lapsed into comfortable silence, the swing moving gently beneath them. Hope rested her head on Yates's shoulder. listening to the night sounds of their little town distant piano music from the hotel, the occasional whinny from the livery stable, crickets in the tall grass beyond their garden. "I had a telegram from the territorial governor today," Yates said after a while, his voice deliberately casual. "There's talk of Montana becoming a state in the next few years. They're starting to organize a more formal territorial police force, something between a marshal and a ranger." Hope lifted her head to look at him. "And they want you," he shrugged, but she could see he was pleased. "They've asked me to consider a position, would mean more responsibility, some travel, but also more security for our future." "You'd be wonderful at it," Hope said sincerely. "You've always had a gift for bringing order without heavy-handedness. People respect that. It would mean changes for all of us," he cautioned. "I wanted to know how you felt before I gave them an answer." Hope considered the question seriously. When she had first come to Montana, she had been so broken by betrayal and abandonment that the idea of making plans beyond the next day had seemed foolhardy. But Yates had taught her to believe in tomorrows again, in the possibility of building something lasting. "I think," she said slowly, "that wherever you go, wherever your duty takes you, that's where our home will be. Melody, Jackson, and I were your family, your constants." The look he gave her was so full of love it made her breath catch. "How did I get so lucky?" he wondered aloud. Hope smiled, remembering that rainy day that had changed everything. "I believe I'm the lucky one, Marshal Blackburn. After all, you're the one who stepped forward when the rest of the world had turned its back." He kissed her then, tender and thorough, a reminder of the passion that still flared between them. When they drew apart, the love in his eyes told Hope everything she needed to know about their future together. "I was lost that day," she whispered against his lips. "Standing in the rain with nothing but a worthless note and a precious baby, and then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even known how to form." "And whispered that I wanted to help," he finished, remembering. "Best words I ever spoke, though I didn't know it at the time." Hope linked her fingers with his, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "I think perhaps we were always meant to find each other, Yates. All the wrong turns and heartaches, they were just the path that led us here. To this porch, on this night, in this town," he agreed. "With our children sleeping safely inside the home we've built together." As the stars wheeled overhead and the Montana night deepened around their little house, Hope knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found her true place in the world. Not in the arms of the man who had abandoned her, but with the one who had seen her at her most vulnerable and offered not judgment but compassion, not empty promises but steadfast love. In the years to come, there would be challenges: a third child born during a blizzard that kept the doctor from reaching them, Yates's new position requiring occasional absences, the growing pains of a territory becoming a state. But through it all, the foundation they had built would remain unshaken. And sometimes, on quiet evenings like this one, Hope would remember the desperate young woman who had stood in the pouring rain clutching her baby and a rain-soaked letter, believing her life was over before it had truly begun. And she would offer a silent prayer of gratitude for the twist of fate that had placed Yates Blackburn in her path, that day, the day her real life had finally started. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of all they had built together. "And I love you," he replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders as the porch swing rocked gently in the Montana night. "Now and forever."